Meeble? Shabba dabba gooba like a meeble. Meeble. Meeble? Shabba dabba gooba like a meeble. Meeble.
Hey y'all, Scott here, and I can't wait to finally head to this game controller issues meeting I just found out about. So, my hands are doing this, and it wouldn't be possible without the overlooked messiah of all video games. While its simplicity made many games hard to convert to the system, it's undeniable it played a key role in its success. No matter who you are, you look at this thing and say, yeah, that makes sense. How could you possibly screw this up? It's a giant red button and a rod. Anybody who's anybody knows what that's about. When you look back at video game successes in the early days, it's apparent that success came with controls that were easy enough for the general consumer to understand. And the 2600 controller was just that. Nevertheless, this thing is just a no-go nowadays. This stick needs to go see a doctor. It's just too stiff. And the overall size of the controller is a problem, for me at least. It's too small to comfortably hold the joystick with one hand and the rest of the controller with the other, and it's too big to comfortably hold it like a modern controller. Overall though, I'd say the 2600 controller was alright for what it was. It's completely usable by anybody, just nothing you jump at the chance to use. After the 2600, controllers went through this ugly phase for a while, and it was all because a controller designer went home for the weekend, looked at his phone and said, "I'm drunk." Why? Yeah, the Intellivision, ColecoVision, even Atari themselves with the Atari 5200 all followed the hot trend of putting a number pad on the controller. Let me ask you this, in what dimension do games this simple need more than 9 buttons? Many games came with overlays to put on the controller so you know what each button does, but that just kinda forces you to constantly look at the controller to know what to press with or without the overlays. In my opinion, that's when a controller fails, when you have to look away from the game to figure out what the hell you're supposed to press. Well, after all that flopped, we then make our way to the Nintendo Entertainment System, a true innovation for controllers, breaking away from the joystick to form something that was more compact and easier to hold. The Vectrex in 1982 had a similar form factor for its controller, but the NES introduced something huge. Now I know, first thing many people probably said when they saw this cross on the controller was, "Pump the brakes, Speed Racer, nobody puts religion in my dig dug." But this cross design called the D-pad made the controller way more comfortable to use with just your thumb. Nintendo used the D-pad beforehand on one of their Game & Watch handhelds, and precursors to it appeared elsewhere, but the NES shot the D-pad into the mainstream, and with that, the joystick was old news. Many consider this guy to have aged poorly, and while I do somewhat agree, I think it's still alright to use. My main problem is the D-pad itself is a bit uncomfortable after long play sessions. But I love the feel of the buttons, just so clicky and satisfying to just go to town on. This is where the term button mashing was born. I see a lot of people say the sharp corners really dig into their hands, but I've never personally had an issue with them. However, the sharpness was criticized even back in the day, so Nintendo responded with some alternatives. The NES Advantage is the controller you'd never let your daughter go to prom with. This thing is a hulking beast that's powered by 2 whole controller ports. You can flip a switch to alternate between player 1 and 2 for games like Super Mario Bros. Where you alternate turns. There's turbo buttons with knobs which allow you to have rapid fire on A and B, and don't forget the state-of-the-art slow motion feature, which was just simply the game constantly pausing and unpausing itself. That meant for games that featured anything on the screen when paused, they just looked off. Regardless, the NES Advantage is a beaut of a controller. I think this thing is really slick. It just feels so sturdy, and there's something so satisfying about pressing these huge buttons. But what if you're not into overcompensating? Well, the NES Max may be for you, featuring a new grippable design, the turbo buttons of the Advantage, alongside something called the Cycloid, a bit of a precursor to the 3DS Circle Pad. It's much easier to grip thanks to these new thighs, but the Cycloid really isn't a replacement for the D-pad in my opinion. Now, with the introduction of the NES Top Loader, Nintendo redesigned the standard NES controller, nicknamed the Dogbone. This thing was so close to being the perfect NES controller. The rounded edges, the nicer feeling D-pad, but they just had to angle the A and B buttons so only a lobster could hold it correctly. It just doesn't feel right. Nobody's hand normally rests like this on a controller. It's just uncomfortable. Well, since the original NES controller worked, many simply tried to copy it. The Sega Master System and TurboGrafx-16 controllers, while different in some ways, were basically just their version of the NES controller. Atari decided to barge into the party with their 7800 controller, and I'm pretty sure everybody stared at them until they released this instead. Only in Europe, though. In the US, we were treated to this, and over there they got this. Lucky them. Of course, Sega had to do something different with the Sega Master System's follow-up, so they brought out this 3-buttoned hunk. Anybody else ever realize just how big the Sega Genesis controller really is? Like, whoa. This guy has some meat on its bones, but weirdly enough, it only has the same amount of buttons as the NES controller. Like, it doesn't have a select button, so even though it has 3 face buttons, they both have 4 in total. That led to problems down the line when fighting games were coming over, which required more buttons, so Sega crammed some more in with the introduction of the 6-button controllers. Shove your hand between the couch cushions and you'll find various Sega Genesis controllers, each different from the last. Like, Sega released so many Genesis controller variants, it's crazy. They're all different in terms of design, button placement, D-pads, it's ridiculous. I interrupt your regularly scheduled me with an emergency report by me. Controllers made by other companies, not the console manufacturers themselves, are running rampant. And most are up to no good. This is the third-party controller watch list. Our mission statement is to bring more awareness to shit. Here we have the TAC-50 joystick for your local Sega Genesis system. It falls in line with the rest of the, I guess if that's what you want sort of thing, controllers. It's not bad, but it doesn't necessarily work well with the vast majority of the Sega Genesis library. It does have these suction cups on its base, which makes it harder to move around on a coffee table, and it also looks pretty good on a windshield. The 6-button controllers are fine and good, but the 3-button one is the classic, the one my mind immediately shoots to when Genesis is on the mind, and it's a solid controller in its own right. It may be a bit bulky, but it feels good. However, it was completely outdone by the makers of Chibi Robo Ziplash. The SNES controller is magnificent. It may not be my favorite of all time, but it does so much so right. The buttons are lined up in this beautiful way where it's so comfortable to use your thumb to press the Y button with the rest of it resting on B, ready to use at a moment's notice. Excellent for games like Super Mario World or Mega Man X. Shoulder buttons came swinging in, L and R, with all buttons in the D-pad feeling exquisite. Couple that with the rounded shape, and this is something that dreams are made of. Weirdly enough, with the release of the Super Nintendo Classic Edition in 2017, Nintendo re-released a new version of the controller with a less glossy, rougher type of plastic for the controller shell. And I gotta say, I actually prefer the new release. It just feels a bit better in my opinion. Atari, just go home. The Atari Jaguar brought back the classic number pad. I'm sure they looked at Sega combating Nintendo by adding more buttons to their controller and shrieked, "Yep, that's the next big craze, more than 12 buttons, the kids will love us." Next up, the original PlayStation came to be due to a failed partnership between Sony and Nintendo, which would focus on a CD add-on for the SNES. After that bust, Sony created their own console based on their knowledge from working with Nintendo, which is pretty obvious looking at the controller. I sometimes forget how similar the PlayStation and SNES controllers are. I mean, fundamentally, the only main differences are the D-pad, 2 sets of shoulder buttons, and thighs. That's it. However, the PlayStation controller finally became a man with the DualShock. Look at the size of these things! This redesign features meteor triggers, a rumble feature, and dual analog sticks. The rumble and analog were obviously responses to the Nintendo 64's controller, which came before it, and we'll get to that in due time. But the DualShock made dual sticks a standard. It also introduced clicking down on the sticks as an additional button input, which, can I say something here? R1, L1, R2, L2. These are shoulder buttons. It makes sense they're numbered like this. Why are these called R3 and L3? Anyways, I love the feel of the analog sticks. They're so smooth and the texture works so well. But what if the DualShock just isn't doing anything for you, and you hate happiness? Here's the Nintendo 64 controller. This came out after the original PlayStation controller and before the DualShock, and man, we can bark about this controller all we want, but gotta admit, this thing was innovative in so many ways. Controlling a game in 3D with the analog control stick, camera control, 4-player multiplayer being standard on the console, even the trigger on the back, give your finger a cock and BAM! This was a huge leap forward for the industry, yes, but answer me this. Just what the hell is this thing? 3 prongs make it so you have multiple ways to play multiple games. Maybe you can hold it like this, or even this. But that means not all the buttons are readily available to the player in any of the controller holding styles. Also, the stick is garbage. This thing is just a skinny, plastic, uncomfortable piece of work that wears out too easily. Now, the Nintendo 64 controller did a lot right. It introduced Rumble with the Rumble Pack accessory. The analog stick brought us games like Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. And look at these colors. This thing is a colorblind Scott Wozniak's worst nightmare. Yep, I don't like this controller. Moving on, the Sega Saturn controller was pretty decent. Basically just an evolution of the Genesis 6-button ones with shoulder buttons this time around. But Sega also introduced the 3D control pad for a few games, specifically Nights into Dreams. And this controller leads us into its immediate successor on Sega's last home console, the Sega Dreamcast controller. Yep, I don't like this controller. Now, is this controller as bad as the Nintendo 64's? God, no. It actually has a layout that makes sense. But this stick is just not comfortable. This was still when many companies didn't realize that hard plastic on an analog stick isn't mankind's favorite thing out there. Also, why does the wire come out of the bottom? There's a groove for you to pop the cord in near the top.